Selamat pagi. Pagi ini kita akan membahas pokok bahasan mengenai ukuran populasi, tren dan implikasinya pada lingkungan. Apakah Anda sudah membaca buku literaturnya? Pada buku literatur, pokok bahasan ini ada pada bab 2. Ukuran populasi penduduk secara inheren terkait dengan lingkungan sebagai hasil dari kebutuhan sumber daya individu serta kontribusi individu terhadap polusi ataupun dampak lainnya terhadap lingkungan. Namun, tidak ada hubungan yang begitu sederhana antara ukuran populasi dan perubahan lingkungan. Jumlah manusia dalam beberapa kasus memiliki dampak langsung terhadap lingkungan. Namun pada beberapa kasus bisa saja hubungan itu secara tidak langsung. Namun lebih sering implikasi lingkungan dari ukuran populasi pada akhirnya ditentukan oleh interaksi yang kompleks di antara banyak kekuatan, termasuk faktor teknologi, konteks politik, kelembagaan, dan juga faktor budaya. Nah, bagaimana dengan pertumbuhan penduduk? Pertumbuhan penduduk menjadi satu fenomena yang terjadi di seluruh penjuru bumi. Fenomena ini dapat didefinisikan sebagai jumlah penduduk di suatu wilayah pada waktu tertentu dibandingkan dengan waktu sebelumnya. Berikut penjelasan dari Profesor Hans Rosling. Mari kita simak.
We live in a world of relentless change. Huge migrations of people to new megacities, filling soaring skyscrapers and vast slums. Ravenous appetites for fuel and food, unpredictable climate change, and all this in a world where the population is still growing. Should we be worried? Should we be scared? How to make sense of it all? 7 billion people now live on this planet of ours. Isn't it beautiful? But when some people think about the world and its future, they panic. Others prefer not to think about it at all. But tonight, I'm going to show you how things really are. My name is Hans Rosling. I'm a statistician at... No! Don't switch off! Because with the latest data from all countries, I'm going to show you the world in a new way. I'm going to tell you how world population is changing and what today's data tell us about how the future of the world will be. We undeniably face huge challenges. But the good news is that the future may not be quite as gloomy and that mankind already is doing better than many of you think. Babies, each one a blessing. But many people think population growth is out of control. Some even talk of a population bomb. Are they right? So where are we with population today, and how did we get here? I'm going to tell you a story about everyone who ever lived. Well, at least during the last some 1,000 years. Here we go. I give you two axes. This is time in years, and this one here is world population in billions. In the year 10,000 BC, when the first people were becoming farmers, then the archaeologists estimate that the world population was only 10 million. Imagine 10 million, that's like Sweden today. A world of only Swedes. But then, as the millennia passed by, more farmers, food and people, and great empires could emerge. Egypt, China, India, and finally Europe. And population continued to grow, but very slowly. And I stop here at the year 1800, because 1800, that's when world population became 1 billion. Imagine all that time, the population growth was just with a tiny fraction of a percent through thousands of years. But here, 1800, with the Industrial Revolution, everything changed, and population started to grow faster. In little more than 100 years, it reached 2 billion. And then, you know, when I was at school, it was 3 billion. And many people said, the planet cannot support more people. Even experts said that. But what happens was this, you know, we became 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion. Imagine, more than half of the world population have been added during my lifetime, and the number is still rising.
Demikian tadi penjelasan dari Profesor Hans Rosling terkait jumlah penduduk di muka bumi dan bagaimana trennya dari tahun ke tahun hingga saat ini. Berikut perkembangan pertumbuhan penduduk bumi berdasarkan benua.
7.6 billion of us now live on the planet, and it's likely there will be a billion more by 2030. But population growth varies from continent to continent. The fastest population rises are in Africa and Asia, which will have 8 of the 10 most populous countries by 2050. India is set to overtake China as the country with the largest population. Nigeria has one of the fastest growing populations in the world. It's set to become the world's 3rd most populous country. In many African countries, women have on average 5 children each. In Niger, it's 7. That's well above the global average of 2.4 children per woman. Populations are also rising because they're aging. Fewer people are dying than are being born. In the last century, life expectancy has almost doubled in some countries. In India, it's almost tripled. However, in some parts of the world, populations are decreasing. Japan's population of 127 million is forecast to shrink by about 1/3 in the next 50 years. But the top 10 countries with the fastest shrinking populations are all in Eastern Europe. These countries suffer from the combined effect of low birth rate, a relatively high mortality rate, and massive out-migration. As populations shift, the world as we know it will change. Today's dominant developed economies will be increasingly focused on supporting the elderly, whereas less developed countries will be transformed by population booms. In 2100, it's projected that 1/3 of all people will live in Africa. A bigger population is a burden, with more people to house, educate and feed. But it's also an opportunity. A large working-age population can boost the economy, as long as there are enough jobs and a strong infrastructure.
Berikut penjelasan mengenai overpopulation dari perspektif ledakan penduduk. Dalam waktu yang sangat singkat, populasi manusia meledak dan masih tumbuh dengan sangat cepat. Akankah ini mengarah pada akhir peradaban kita? Simak penjelasannya ya.
Never before in history have there been so many people on Earth as right now. Our numbers have skyrocketed from 1 billion in 1800 to 2.3 billion in 1940, 3.7 billion in 1970, and 7.4 billion in 2016. The world population increased fourfold in the last century, so what can we expect for the next century? And what does population growth mean for our future? Will there be mass migration, overcrowded slums in megacities covering continents, diseases and pollution, chaos and violence over energy, water and food, and a human species focused only on sustaining itself? Will population growth destroy our way of life, or is this prophecy just ungrounded panic? In the 1960s, population growth reached an unprecedented rate, which led to apocalyptic prophecies. The poor would procreate endlessly and overrun the developed world. the legend of overpopulation was born. But it turns out high birth rates and the population explosion are not permanent features of some cultures or countries, but rather part of a four-step process the whole world is going through, the demographic transition. Most developed countries have already made the transition, while other countries are doing it right now. Let's go back to the 18th century, when the entire world, including Europe, was in the first stage of the demographic transition. By today's standards, Europe was worse off than a developing region, suffering from poor sanitation, poor diets, and poor medicine. A lot of people were born, but lots of them died just as fast, so the population hardly grew. Women had between 4 and 6 children, but only 2 of them would reach adulthood. Then the Industrial Revolution happened in the UK and brought the greatest change in human living conditions since the Agricultural Revolution. People went from being peasants to workers. Manufactured goods were mass-produced and became widely available. The sciences flourished and advanced transportation, communication and medicine. The role of women in society shifted and created the conditions for their emancipation. Slowly, this economic progress not only formed a middle class, but also raised standards of living and healthcare for the poor working population. The second transition stage started. Better food supplies, hygiene and medicine meant people stopped dying all the time, especially so at a very young age. The result was a population explosion, doubling the UK's population between 1750 and 1850. The main reason families used to have lots of children was that only a few of them were likely to survive. Now that had changed, so the third stage of the transition was set in motion, fewer babies were conceived, and population growth slowed down. Eventually, a balance emerged. Fewer people were dying and fewer children were born, so the death rate and birth rate became stable. Britain had reached the fourth stage of the demographic transition. This didn't only happen in the UK. More and more countries went through the 4 stages. First, many births and many deaths due to bad living conditions. Second, better living conditions leading to fewer deaths and a population explosion. Third, fewer deaths resulting in fewer births and population growth came to an end. But if birth rates have dropped so much, why is the population still growing so fast? Well, the children born in the population explosion of the 70s and 80s are having kids themselves now, leading to a noticeable spike in overall population. But they are having far fewer children on average than their parents. The average today is 2.5. It was 5 40 years ago. So as this generation gets older and fertility declines further, the rate of population growth will keep on slowing. This is true for every country. In the West, we tend to overlook progress in other regions of the world, but actually most of the world's countries have made it to the 4th stage. Just look at Bangladesh. In 1971, the average woman had 7 kids, but 25% of them would die before the age of 5. In 2015, the mortality rate was down to 3.8%, and women had only 2.2 kids on average. This is the rule, not an exception. We're not special. We just had a head start. It took developed countries about 80 years to reduce fertility from more than 6 children to less than 3. Others are catching up fast. Malaysia and South Africa did it in only 34 years. Bangladesh took just 20. Iran managed it in 10 years. All these countries that are catching up didn't have to start from scratch, and the more support they get, the faster they catch up. This is why programs that help lower child mortality or help poor nations develop are so important. No matter what your motivation is, whether you dream of a world where all people live in freedom and wealth, or you just want fewer refugees coming to your country, the simple truth is that it's beneficial to you personally if people on the other side of the globe can live a good life. And we are getting there. The percentage of people living in extreme poverty has never been as low as today. So the future of global population growth is actually not an apocalyptic prophecy at all. It's a promise. Population growth will come to an end. The UN forecasts that the 12th billionth human will never be born at all. And as the development level of the world rises, the number of people with a higher education will increase tenfold. Countries who used to be in need will help advance development instead. More people is going to mean more people able to advance our species. This video was a collaboration with Max Rosa and Our World in Data, where he explores the progress of humanity through research and data visualization. Make sure to check it out.
Selanjutnya adalah gambaran mengenai perkembangan atau ancaman ledakan penduduk di Indonesia.
Tahun yang lalu, bumi kita hanya diisi dengan 250 juta manusia. Dunia masih sepi. Jumlah manusia masih kalah banyak dibandingkan jumlah harimau atau gajah yang ada di hutan-hutan. Tapi, lambat laun, jumlah manusia semakin bertambah. Manusia terus beranak pinak, melahirkan generasi-generasi baru penghuni bumi. Manusia mulai membabat hutan untuk dijadikan rumah dan perkampungan. Harimau, gajah, dan hewan-hewan liar lainnya pun mulai tergeser oleh semakin banyaknya manusia. Awalnya, pertumbuhan jumlah penduduk dunia sangat lambat. Pada abad ke-1 Masehi, saat lahirnya Nabi Isa, jumlah penduduk dunia hanya 250 juta jiwa. Jumlah ini berkembang secara lambat dan baru mencapai angka 1 miliar jiwa penduduk dunia pada tahun 1804 atau 18 abad kemudian. Namun, sejak abad 20, pertumbuhan penduduk dunia semakin cepat dan menjadi sangat cepat. 33 tahun kemudian penduduk dunia bertambah menjadi 3 miliar jiwa dan hanya memerlukan waktu 12 tahun kemudian, yaitu pada tahun 1975, penduduk dunia bertambah lagi menjadi 4 miliar jiwa. Dan akhirnya tahun 2011, jumlah penduduk dunia pun meledak menjadi 7 miliar jiwa. 273 juta jiwa di antaranya tinggal di Indonesia. Ledakan jumlah penduduk juga terjadi di Indonesia. Pada abad 16, saat Patih Gajah Mada mengucapkan Sumpah Palapa, jumlah penduduk di wilayah Indonesia hanya 10,8 juta jiwa. Satu abad kemudian, bertambah hanya 3,4 juta jiwa, menjadi 14,2 juta jiwa. Pada tahun 1900, jumlah penduduk Indonesia meningkat 2 kali lipat menjadi 40,2 juta jiwa. Dan pada tahun 2000, jumlah penduduk Indonesia meningkat dengan cepat menjadi 205,8 juta jiwa. Dan hanya selisih 10 tahun kemudian, penduduk Indonesia pun bertambah dengan cepat menjadi 237,6 juta jiwa. Ledakan jumlah penduduk sebenarnya telah terjadi tandanya pada tahun 2000. Pada saat itu, gerakan KB yang telah dikampanyekan pemerintah sejak tahun 1907 mulai terlihat dampaknya. Kampanye keluarga berencana telah berhasil menekan angka kematian ibu dan anak, sehingga banyak lahir anak-anak yang kemudian disebut era baby booming. Penemuan di bidang kesehatan juga ikut memberi andil. Teknologi kesehatan yang semakin canggih membuat jumlah kematian semakin kecil dan usia hidup manusia juga semakin lama. Alhasil, boom, jumlah penduduk pun meledak, meningkat berlipat-lipat dalam waktu yang juga semakin singkat. Lalu, apa yang akan terjadi jika ledakan jumlah penduduk ini dibiarkan begitu saja? Nah, kalau dibiarkan, apa yang akan terjadi kemudian? 1. Sumber daya alam yang terbatas akan membuat perebutan sumber daya alam akan semakin tinggi. Bagaimanapun canggihnya teknologi yang diciptakan, manusia tetap memiliki ketergantungan terhadap sumber daya alam. Kebutuhan akan pangan, sandang dan papan, semua masih tergantung pada kemampuan alam untuk memproduksi. 2. Jumlah lahan yang terbatas akan membuat manusia saling berebut lahan. Padahal, isi bumi bukan hanya manusia, juga ada binatang dan tumbuh-tumbuhan yang juga mempunyai peran penting untuk menunjang hidup manusia. Bayangkan, jika sawah dan hutan harus dijadikan tempat tinggal manusia, maka dari mana manusia bisa mendapatkan makanan dan sumber oksigen yang sehat? 3. Perubahan iklim dan ekologi juga akan terjadi. Bumi akan semakin panas, permukaan laut meninggi, lapisan ozon menebal. Semua masalah itu berawal dari sampah-sampah lingkungan yang dihasilkan oleh umat manusia. 4. Akan terjadi masalah sosial yang pelik karena akan terjadi persaingan sengit antar manusia untuk bisa hidup layak, mendapatkan pekerjaan dan penghasilan, serta sumber makanan dan tempat tinggal. Yang jelas, ledakan penduduk akan membuat bumi akan semakin sesak oleh manusia. Kepadatan penduduk semakin tinggi, dan manusia pun harus tinggal berhimpit-himpitan. Kata Profesor Jared Diamond dalam bukunya Collapse, ledakan penduduk yang tidak terkendali bisa menyebabkan kepunahan umat manusia karena akan terjadi ecological suicide atau bunuh diri umat manusia karena terjadinya kerusakan lingkungan. Peneliti lain, Nina Fedorov, bahkan mengatakan bahwa jumlah penduduk dunia saat ini sudah melebihi daya dukung dan daya tampung lingkungan, sehingga akan semakin banyak manusia yang kelaparan dan kesulitan air. Nah, jika melihat fakta-fakta ini, apakah Anda masih bisa santai? Bumi sedang dalam ancaman. Ancaman itu berasal dari kita sendiri, makhluk yang disebut manusia, yang tidak mampu mengendalikan pertumbuhannya. Apakah Anda masih berpikir ingin punya 3 atau 4 anak lagi? Atau Anda ingin Indonesia yang begitu keras membatasi jumlah penduduknya? Setiap manusia, kita harus sadar akan ancaman ledakan penduduk. Setiap orang kini harus arif untuk membuat perencanaan keluarga yang baik dan menciptakan keluarga yang kecil, berkualitas dan efektif. Mari kita selamatkan bumi dari ancaman ledakan jumlah penduduk dunia agar kita dan anak cucu kita bisa hidup nyaman di bumi anugerah ilahi ini.
Diskusi berikutnya adalah berapa banyak populasi penduduk yang dapat didukung bumi, atau how many people can Earth support. Mari kita simak pendapat para ahli berikut. Thomas Malthus, filsuf abad ke-18, menyebutkan kekuatan populasi sangat jauh di atas kekuatan bumi untuk memproduksi penghidupan bagi manusia, sehingga kematian prematur dalam satu bentuk atau bentuk lain akan dialami umat manusia. Esainya, Malthus menuliskan masa depan yang suram dari manusia. Manusia punya dorongan yang tidak bisa diredam untuk bereproduksi, yang pada akhirnya akan membuat planet mengalami overpopulasi dan memakan seluruh sumber daya yang ada. Pada akhirnya umat manusia akan mati karena kelaparan massal. Pertanyaan, berapakah sebenarnya kekuatan planet bumi untuk memproduksi sumber daya dan berapa batas jumlah populasi planet ini? Lebih penting lagi, apakah visi Malthus terhadap masa depan umat manusia tersebut benar? Dari Live Little Mysteries 13 Oktober 2011, banyak ilmuwan yang memperkirakan bahwa bumi mampu menampung manusia hingga 9 sampai 10 miliar jiwa. Salah satunya adalah Edward Wilson, sosiobiologis dari Harvard University, yang menyimpulkan berdasarkan kalkulasi terhadap sumber daya yang dimiliki bumi.
Let me tell you why I think that the 21st century is going to be known as the century of the environment, with a strong emphasis on biology. The immediate future can be usefully conceived as a bottleneck of overpopulation and inefficient resource utilization. Science and technology, combined with a lack of self-understanding on the part of our species and the Paleolithic obstinacy that led to these ruinous practices, have brought us to where we are today. Now science and technology, combined with foresight and moral courage, both guided by a more enlightened ethic, has to see us through that bottleneck of overpopulation and wasteful consumption, and out the other end, presumably by the end of the century. Two collateral effects of the bottleneck phenomenon are worth especially our attention and are worrisome. The first is that the rich go richer and the poor grow poorer around the world. The income difference, for example, between the fifth of the world's population in the wealthiest countries and the fifth in the poorest countries was 30 to 1 in 1960, 60 to 1 in 1990, and now 74 to 1. 800 million people still remain in what the United Nations classifies as absolute poverty. That is, no sanitation, no clean water, rampant disease, rampant infant mortality, periodic starvation. Even if the income differential is dismissed as a humanitarian issue, it should be considered a security issue. It's a setting, I think, as we all now understand, for resentment and fanaticism, which we have learned so well in the Middle East. The second collateral effect, interlocked with the first, is the accelerating destruction of the natural environment, leading to the mass extinction of species and ecosystems. The damage that's already done cannot be repaired in any period of time that has any meaning for the human mind, and the more that is allowed to go on in the century, the more future generations are going to suffer for it in ways that are both well understood already and which are painfully to be learned. Why future generations will ask us, did you, by extinguishing the lives of so many other species, so diminish our own? The radical reduction of the Earth's biodiversity is the folly our descendants.
Selanjutnya, pakar lain yaitu Joel Cohen, population biologis asal Columbia University, mengatakan faktor lingkungan lain yang membatasi kapasitas tampung bumi adalah siklus nitrogen, ketersediaan fosfor, dan konsentrasi karbon di atmosfer. Akan tetapi, ada ketidakpastian yang sangat besar terkait dampak seluruh faktor ini. Mengatakan sejujurnya tidak ada yang tahu kapan atau sampai titik mana jumlah populasi maksimal dicapai. Namun, Cohen memprediksi jumlah penduduk akan mengalami titik balik setelah mencapai 11 miliar. Bagaimana penjelasannya? Mari kita simak video berikut ini.
My name is Joel Cohen. I'm professor of populations at the Rockefeller University and at Columbia University in New York City. Why should you consider taking a course in demography in college? You will be growing up in the generation where the baby boomers are going into retirement and dying. You will face problems in the aging of the population that have never been faced before. You will hear more and more about migration into the United States and in some cases out, into Europe and out, between rural areas and cities. You need to understand as a citizen and as a taxpayer and as a voter what's really behind the arguments. I want to tell you about the past, present, and future of the human population. So let's start with a few problems. Right now, 1 billion people are chronically hungry. That means they wake up hungry, they're hungry all day, and they go to sleep hungry. 1 billion people are living in slums. Not the same billion people, but there's some overlap. Living in slums means they don't have tenure in their homes, they don't have infrastructure to take the garbage away, they don't have secure water supplies to drink. Nearly 1 billion people are illiterate. Try to imagine your life being illiterate. You can't read the labels on the bottles in the supermarket. If you could get to a supermarket, 2/3 of those people who are illiterate are women. And about 200 to 215 million women don't have access to the contraceptives they want so that they can control their own fertility. This is not only a problem in developing countries. About half of all pregnancies are unintended. Those are examples of population problems. Demography gives you the tools to address and to understand these problems. It's the study of populations of humans and non-human species. That includes viruses like influenza, the bacteria in your gut, plants that you eat, animals that you enjoy or that provide your domestic animals, and it includes non-living objects like light bulbs and taxicabs and buildings, because these are also populations. And it includes the study of these populations in the past, present, and future, using quantitative data and mathematical models as tools of analysis. I see demography as a central subject related to economics, to human well-being as in material terms, related to the environment, to the well-being of the other species with which we share the planet, and culture, which affects our values and how we interact with one another. The key fact you need to remember is that since the inventions of agriculture between 6,000 and 14,000 years ago, the population of the Earth, the human population, has grown 1,000-fold. From approximately 7 million, maybe 14,000 years ago, to nearly 7 billion this year. Put 3 zeros on the end of 7 million, you get 7 billion. Over the same interval, the Earth has not gotten any bigger. The continents haven't expanded 1,000-fold or at all. The oceans are the same size as they were before. The atmosphere is the same size as it was before. So the question that concerns a lot of people, and me, is whether the impact that 7 billion people or more in the future will have on the Earth will endanger our own well-being and the well-being of other species on the Earth. We know that humans have already caused the extinction of many species. The question is that going to come back and bite us? And if so, in what ways? Demography provides us with a reliable way to imagine and to reimagine the future. So let's get down to some nitty-gritty details here. About 2,000 years ago, there were roughly 250 million people on the planet. Today, there are almost 7 billion. More than 6/7 of that growth, in fact, more than 6/7 of the growth since the beginning of humans 50,000 years ago, has occurred in the last 200 years. To go from 250 million to 500 million took 16 centuries. So we reached about 500 million humans about 1600, more or less. The human population of the Earth, if it were growing exponentially, would go from 250 million to half in 16 centuries and from half to 1 in another 16 centuries. What actually happened was that the human population of the Earth reached 1 billion around 1800. Because of foodstuffs that came from the New World to the Old, notably potato and corn or maize, and because many of the people who were overcrowded in Europe went to America where there were fertile and unoccupied lands to use. So the East-West exchange, the Columbian exchange across the Atlantic, liberated population growth in the European sector. There was a similar development in Japan, an acceleration of population growth around the same time. In 1800, the Industrial Revolution began, and the population doubled from 1 billion to 2 billion by 1930, 1927. We don't know exactly. Why don't we know exactly? Because we didn't have censuses that covered the whole world at that time. So it's a retrospective guess. So our doubling times went from 1,600 years to 200 years, 1600 to 1800, to 130 years, 1800 to 1930. The next doubling from 2 billion to 4 billion took only 44 years, 1974. So until the last half century, human population growth has been faster than exponential. But this slide that you've been looking at is like a shower curtain. What it reveals is a little less interesting than what it conceals. And so I'd like to zoom in on the part of history from 1950 to now. We've zoomed in to the last 50 years. The red vertical line on the slide is now. And it begins on the left side in 1950 and runs up to 2011. And what you see is that the annual population growth rate reached a peak of about 2.1% per year in the years 1965 to 1970, and since then has fallen by half to about 1.1% per year. So for the last 2,000 years at least, except for the Black Death in the 14th century, the population growth rate was going up, 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 and around 1965, it began to decline. If you look, there's a sharp dip before 1965, a very sharp valley. That is the Great Leap Forward in China, which killed about 30 million people unnecessarily. But the global peak of 2.1% per year has since led to a decline by a half. So in absolute terms and in percentage terms, the number of people we're adding to the planet has begun to slow. Since 1950, humans have made the swiftest voluntary change in reproduction in human history. Around 1950, the average number of children per woman per lifetime was very close to 5. Today, the average number of children per woman is about 2.5 or 2.6. In other words, billions of people have changed their reproductive behavior to lower the number of children born in a lifetime from 5 to 2.5, but not everywhere. In sub-Saharan Africa, the decline has been much less, from perhaps 6.6 children to 5.1 over the second half of the 20th century. To understand the consequences of this fall to 2.5 children per woman, you need to know what is meant by replacement level fertility. So I am going to introduce that by telling you about the theory of bathtubs. A regular bathtub with no stopper. Water comes in and water goes out. Now, water coming in corresponds to births, to the earth. And water going out corresponds to death. And the level of the bathtub corresponds to the total population size. So, if the number of births just matches the number of deaths, the population stays steady, and that's the replacement level fertility. Now, you're asking yourself, what is the replacement level of fertility? The answer is about 2.1 children per woman. There has been an amazing transformation in the distribution of fertility across the world in the last half century. I want you to look carefully at this slide. The vertical line is replacement level fertility. The horizontal axis is total fertility rate, children per woman per lifetime, and the vertical axis is the percent of world population. So it's 0 at the bottom, a quarter, half, 75%, and 100% at the top. In 1950, the black line that's at the bottom, practically everywhere, women were having more than replacement level fertility. They are on the right of the red line. By 1975, roughly, a quarter of women had moved to the left of replacement, and 3/4 were still over to the right. In 2003, this was not in any newspaper anywhere, but it was a very important event. In 2003, half of all the women in the world were having replacement level or less. They moved to the left of the red line. And now more than half of humanity lives in a country at or below replacement level fertility. It's the first time in human history that this has happened, and it's important. But you remember that the total fertility rate, the average number of children per woman, is at 2.5, not 2.1. And that's because on this curve, the green curve, the folks with high fertility are further to the right of the red line than most of the folks with low fertility are to the left. So the average is skewed to the right. So we still have a growing population. But this change is continuing. And how fast it continues is something that you, as voters, as potential scientists, as citizens, will influence by what you choose to do about the 215 million women who have an unmet need for contraception. So much for the past. Let's go on to the present. This is a population pyramid. It's one of the basic descriptive tools of demography, and you should understand what it is. Let's start with the left side of the picture. The horizontal axis, the width of the bar, tells you how many people there are. And the vertical axis corresponds to age group. So the lowest bar is for people aged 0 to 4, with males on the left and females on the right. The next bar is people aged 5 to 9. The top bar is 85 or 90. And what you see is that in the rich countries, there are about as many people aged, let's say, 0 to 4 as there are aged 85 or 90. But it's basically a slender column. Now compare it with the age pyramid for the poor countries. The base of the pyramid is enormous compared to the number of elderly. So there are many more workers to support the elderly per elderly person. The width of the bar, again, is number of people. So in the ranges from 5 to 14 or 5 to 19, that's the school-age population. It means that the challenge of educating those children is much greater in the developing countries than it is in the rich countries, because those bars keep getting wider as the developing countries pump in more children at the bottom of the pyramid. The age groups move up with time as they get older, and so the larger school-age population is followed 10 years later by a much larger military-age population. So if you look at the age groups 15 to 30, you can see that the potential military force in the developing countries vastly exceeds that in the rich countries. It doesn't mean it's military power for them. It means they can afford a military engagement in a way that the human resources of the rich countries make very difficult, increasingly difficult. So where's the growth going? The demographic growth is happening in the countries that can least afford to deal with the additional population. What's the average income? The reason we call the rich countries rich is that their average income is about $32,000 a year per person, and in the poor countries it's about $5,000 a year. What fraction of people are living on less than $2 a day? Nobody lives on less than $2 a day in the rich countries, and 51%, just about half, in the poor countries. In other words, about 3.5 billion people on our planet are living on $2 a day or less. You might ask yourself, if things are so bad there, how is it that their population is growing so rapidly? And the fact is that the difference in death rates is much smaller than the difference in fertility rates. So even though a higher fraction of children die before they reproduce, the average number of children that people have when they do reproduce in the poor countries more than compensates for the increase in the death rate. So that's why we have rapid population growth at the same time that we have high mortality, because we have even higher fertility. It's an important general question: how does the rich world benefit from the prosperity and development of the poor world? There are lots of different answers you can give. One is purely economic. Richer people in China and Africa will buy more American music CDs, and more movies, and more software, and more high-tech engines from General Electric, and more products, because they have more means to buy. So that's one kind of an answer. A second is public health. There are millions of flights in both directions from the poor countries to the rich countries every year. And the microbes don't know about passports. And they cross from Mumbai to New York just as fast as they go from New York to Mumbai. And when there are outbreaks of drug-resistant tuberculosis, those can travel around the world, and they pose a danger to me and to you guys. So we have an interest in the health and well-being, a direct personal interest in the health and well-being of people in poor countries. So now we've talked about the demographic past and the demographic present. And next we're going to talk about the demographic future. Woody Allen said, "Eternity is very long, especially near the end." So we're not going to talk about eternity. We are only going to talk about the near-term future. How much of the future is relevant to you? Well, according to the United States Life Tables published by the National Center for Health Statistics, an 18-year-old in the United States in the year 2011 has a 91% chance of surviving to 2050. 91%, based on survival rates in 2006. If you behave wisely, and if economic and medical progress continue, you have at least that good a chance of making it to 2050. So we're going to talk about the world from now to 2050. I can say with confidence that 4 things will happen over the next 40 years or so. The world's population will get bigger. It will grow more slowly. It will be older in the sense that the fraction of older people will increase dramatically, and it will be more urban. And I'm going to go through each of those 4 to explain some of the details. What we don't know too much about is what will be the future of migration, the future of household structures, and the future of families. We have some ideas about that, but that's relatively less certain. This graph shows curves of the history and future population out to 2050. At the top, the curve shows the anticipated population if fertility remains at the level it is today and there's no further decline in fertility. That's called the constant fertility assumption. And it shows that the world would go to about 11 billion people by 2050. However, if fertility drops as it has dropped in the past, the medium projection of the UN Population Division is that population would rise to about 9.1 billion by 2050. So that's a difference of 2 billion. In other words, we're counting on a continuing decline in fertility to lower the population size by about 2 billion by 2050. What we do between now and 2050 will have a huge impact on how difficult it is to feed, house, shelter, educate, and provide health for the billions of people on the planet in 2050. It will affect an enormous range of human problems. It's possible that population growth would end before 2100, depending on the choices we make now. What choices am I talking about? Choices like educating women, providing credit to women in countries where women are not now allowed to have credit, providing reproductive health care so that women are not forced, as they are in some countries, to have children when they don't want to, raising the age of marriage so that 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 14-year-olds aren't put into marriage. There's a lot of things we can do to raise people, including even women, raise people's control over their own lives, and we should be doing those things. The second fact about the future is that the population is going to grow more slowly. The slowing will depend on what we do now. By 2050, in the medium projection from the United Nations Population Division, the world will be growing by 31 million people a year. What's it doing now? It's growing by 76 million people a year. In the poor countries, population will be growing by 32 million a year, while in the rich countries, population will actually be declining by 1 million people a year. Already today, in 2011, population is declining in more than 50 countries, not well known. What's happening here is a shift in childbearing desires and action from quantity to quality. As people urbanize, as people get educated, as wealth improves, people are making greater investments in a smaller number of children. So we've talked about population size, growth rate. The next is aging. So by 2050, there will be about 3 times as many elderly as children. This is the first time in human history that the elderly population has outnumbered the young population. So what? Who cares? Well, aging affects energy demand. So even if you're interested in the environment, you need to know about the age structure of populations. Older householders, at least in the United States, India, and China, the 3 countries where it's been studied in detail, spend more than younger households, measured by the age of the head, on utilities, services, and health care. Utilities are the most energy-intensive part of the household budget. That's not the only reason to care. The rise in the fraction of elderly poses an increasing challenge to a relatively reduced number of workers. And it's possible that the well-being of elderly people could improve if they're educated, or could get worse if they are warehoused in old people's homes. We know, for example, that people who are educated in their youth have much lower disability when they get older. And in fact, disability rates at any given age in the United States have been dropping by about 1.5% per year for the last 25 years. So there are far fewer disabled elderly now than there used to be. That's the meaning of 60 is the new 40, 50 is the new 30. People are healthier at older ages. That's a result of investment in education in youth. So there are policy implications for a rising aged population. We better invest in educating people when young. And the last of the 4 topics is cities. And I'm going to give you a very simplified and boiled down demographic history of the first half of the 21st century. In 2000, you could divide the world into 2 equal parts, half rural and half urban. So that was about 3 billion rural and 3 billion urban. In 2050, the rural population will still be at 3 billion, and the urban population will have doubled from 3 billion to 6 billion. All of those additional 3 billion urban people will be in poor countries. The equivalent of a city of 1 million people will have to be built every 5 days from now to 2050, and all of them in poor countries. So what's the consequence? What does this massive shift towards urbanization mean? If we underinvest in cities, we can go from 1 billion people living in slums today to 4 billion people living in slums. And if we invest in the cities, if the real estate companies realize the opportunities, the incredible demand that people have to live in decent housing, we could reduce the size of the slums. So I cannot give you a deterministic picture. I can tell you what would be awful. We could have infectious diseases rampant. We could have warfare in the cities. We could have disorder. But that's not necessary. We could have clean water supplies. We could have security for people in their houses. That doesn't get as much news attention. But the point I want to make is we have choices about the future of cities. And many things about urbanization are positive. And I want to tell you a few of the things that are positive. Not because they're automatic, but because they are positive in fact, and because we can enhance the positive. Compared to rural areas, urban areas have lower fertility rates. Why? I'm a woman on the farm. You might not think so, but I am. Okay, I'm a woman on the farm. The more children I have, the more help I can have in collecting the water, collecting the firewood, and attending to the goats and sheep. As soon as I move into a city, those children convert from an asset to a liability. I have to buy them clothing. I have to send them to school. There are school fees. The apartment is too small. The incentives completely shift direction. Urbanization makes people want to have fewer children. Cities also have higher usage of modern contraception and lower unmet needs for contraception. Why? I am a woman. You might not know it. I don't have to walk 15 miles to the nearest health center and be exposed to the inspection of my husband's friends when I go in for contraception. No, when I'm in the city, I just go around the corner and it's anonymous. So urbanization brings many features of liberation as well as changing the incentives. Cities concentrate economic productivity. 80% of the world's gross domestic product is produced in cities, although there are only 50% of the world's people in cities. Cities generate cultural assets, educational resources, public health resources, medical care, and they can promote energy efficiency. Let me give an example. This graph shows the passenger transport carbon dioxide per person. The denser the city, the lower the amount of carbon dioxide per person. New York City is reported, according to the mayor's office, to have less than 1/3 the carbon dioxide emissions per person of the U.S. average. People take the subway. People ride the bus. Cities also have hazards. Many cities are built along coastlines. Coastlines are where the continental plates of the oceans collide with the continents. That means they are prone to earthquakes. We just had the big example in Japan, but it's true all around the world. The ring of fire around the Pacific Ocean coincides with where the cities are. Because cities are coastal, a lot of the world's urban people live near the coastline, and that's where the subduction zones are in California. I'm going to show you 3 slides of New York City where I live. This is New York City as it is now. The red zone will be underwater if the water level rises by 1 meter on the average. 1 meter is probably more than we'll have in the next 50 years, but could easily happen by the end of the century at current rates. Now, a 6-meter rise would happen if the Greenland and Antarctic ice masses melted. 6 meters is about 20 feet. That would be a catastrophe in many respects, including, for me, there's a little place over here in New Jersey, which is my favorite nudist colony, and it would be completely underwater. So that would be a terrible thing to happen. So cities are vulnerable to rising sea level, to coastal storms. Cities concentrate people, so they're vulnerable to infectious diseases, water supply attacks, and cities are excellent targets for military and terrorist attacks, as we know in New York City and many other cities. Used to be, battles were fought on battlegrounds. No more. They're fought in cities. And that will increasingly be the case as cities concentrate assets. Urban growth could affect the food supply. Right now, cities occupy 3% of the land surface of the earth. The arable land, the land where we can grow food well, is about 10 or 11% of the land surface of the earth. It's not surprising that many cities are smack in the middle of the best arable land, because that was where a food surplus could be easily produced without having to ship the food. Now, if cities are going to double, we have another choice. Do we double the area from 3% to 6% and eat up our arable land, literally, or do we double the density and keep the areas of the cities constant at 3%? This is a choice for the future, and it depends on zoning and culture and real estate developers and economics and choices that we make as citizens. How do we address the problems we have? There are 3 kinds of solutions that people have put forward. Bigger pie, fewer forks, better manners. The bigger pie people say we should use technology to increase production. The fewer forks people say we should use contraception to reduce population growth, and we should consume less material products. And the better manners people say we should eliminate violence, inequities between men and women, inequities between rich and poor, inequities between young and old. We should eliminate irrational subsidies and just make things work more efficiently, get rid of corruption. I took a few years to try to figure out what's my best way to support those 3 strategies, all of them. And I came to the conclusion that the best response would be to educate all children, boys and girls, well, for 10 to 12 years, high-quality primary and secondary education. I realized there's no chance of educating people if their brains haven't been fed adequately in utero and after birth, especially for the first 3 years. So I am now moving around to working on the problem of getting food, adequate, good food, to pregnant women, lactating women, and infants up to the age of 3. Because there are many countries where by the time a child gets to school, it's too late. The brain has lost its capacity to learn. So now we're talking about food. I started this conversation saying that there are 1 billion hungry people, chronically hungry. I want to come back to this. We depend on other species. Here is a list of what other species provide to humans. And I'm going to read the list because it's important. Food for people, feed for our domestic animals, fuel, biofuel, for example, and wood to burn, biomass, and in many countries people burn dung, the waste products of animals. That's an important source of fuel. Fiber, so we depend on trees for many paper and other products. Fascination. We love to go to the zoo and see animals. We love to see wildlife. When people go out in nature, they're thrilled if they see a deer or some other kind of wildlife. In fact, in Central Park, the German tourists are thrilled to see squirrels. We find animals fascinating. Pharmaceuticals. Most of our drugs are natural products tuned up to serve human needs. Animals provide transport. They carry people places. They provide traction. They pull plows. They pull carts. Other species provide symbioses. I've talked about the animals, not the animals, the bacteria that live in our guts. And they provide infection. They can cause disease. So the question I want to address now is, can we grow enough food to bring us to 2050 without catastrophe? These are data from the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. They are estimates of the number of people in the world who are chronically undernourished day after day. The current estimate is about 925 million. The current estimate is about 925 million people. That's nearly 1 billion, and it is higher than the number has been in the last 40 years. 98% of these people live in poor countries. Not only poor countries. Here is something that shocked me, and I hope it will shock you. At some point during 2009, 17.4 million U.S. households, 1 household in 7 in the United States, lacked enough money and other resources to provide enough food for all members of the household. The current level of food insecurity in the United States is higher than it has been since the USDA started collecting these statistics by sample surveys in 1995. We are at an all-time high of hunger in this country. So the question you should be asking yourself is, well, aren't we growing enough food? What's the problem? The answer is less than half of the grain that we grow goes into people's mouths. Divide the world's grain into 6 equal pieces. 1 piece we use to make biofuels, starches, for seed and other industrial uses, plastics. 2/6 we feed to our domestic animals of the rich people, those who have the means to afford those animals and meat products. Less than half, the other 3/6, goes directly into human mouths. We could be feeding 11 billion, but we only feed half of that amount, 5.5 billion, into human mouths. We put machines and animals in line before people who don't have money to express demand in markets. Hunger doesn't fit into our economic theories. It's economically invisible because people who are very poor can't enter the market and plunk down their cash and say, I want that. They are invisible economically. So my hunger does not affect your costs for grain. This is a problem with our economics. And it's a reflection of our values. Do we value the hunger of other people? So, here's Joel's formula for how to solve the world's problems. Well, population. Let's go at it with all hammer and tongs. Eliminate unintended pregnancies and educate all children to give people control over their bodies and their own lives. Economics. Open credits and markets to small farmers. A majority of the world's farmers are women. They are the ones out in the field actually doing the work. Eliminate perverse subsidies. Subsidies in rich countries make it very difficult for poor farmers to enter markets because they lower the price in artificial ways. And let's raise the incomes of the poor. Environment. Use the best farmlands for farms and internalize the external costs of agriculture. Get rid of the pollution and use chemicals in a way that doesn't damage the environment. Fourth, culture. Promote healthy diets and value adequate nutrition for every person. I would add one other thing under this culture question, and that is we need to fund more research in agricultural productivity for the crops that matter in poor countries, not only for the industrial crops that fund our biofuel habit, but for the crops that provide food to the poor. When you walk away from this conversation, I hope that you'll remember that population interacts with economics, the environment, and culture so that you immunize yourself against people who will try to sell you an overly simple bill of goods. And there are a lot of people. There are people who say demography is destiny. All we have to do is get a contraceptive in every pot and we'll solve the world's problems. That's wrong. And there are people who say all we have to do is get the market right. Let the market take care of all the prices. In my view, that is equally wrong and much more dangerous. There are people who say it's only a matter of law and getting the laws right. Yeah, but it's also a matter of technology and contraception and economics. And there are people who say, forget about the people, let's just save the environment. I don't believe that, because I'm a human being and I value other human beings. We've got to get all of these things working together, and the environment can be on the side of human well-being because poor rural people depend directly on the environment for their sustenance. If they want to have a sustainable sustenance, they have to have a sustainable environment. Demography makes it possible to imagine and to reimagine the future. I'd encourage any freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, adult, high school student, I'm not age prejudiced, anybody to consider demography. It's not the only field that offers these attractions, but it does offer them in spades. It's really very attractive. First of all, demography gives you tools and analytical perspectives to understand better the world around you. Secondly, it gives you equipment to solve problems mentally. And third, it is the means to intervene more wisely and more effectively in the real world to improve the well-being not only of yourself, important as that may be, but of people around you and of other species with whom we share the planet. So it prepares you to go out and do something that's worth doing for a larger good than only yourself. So there's an old saying, if I am not for myself, who will be? But if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So now is the time. Pull up your pants and get to work. Thank you.
Berikut pakar lainnya, Profesor Hans Lolling yang juga memprediksi bahwa jumlah penduduk bumi tidak akan melebihi 11 miliar. Bagaimana penjelasannya? Mari kita simak video berikut.
So an overview would be like this. In the past, the two parents on average got 6 children. The reason the population was not growing here from the year 2000, from the year, when we started agriculture way back then, 5,000 years ago, it took 5,000 years to go from 10 million to 1 billion. This is 1 billion here. It is because 1, 2, 3, 4 died sadly before growing up to have children themselves. The past was ugly. Human beings have never ever lived in ecological balance with nature. That's a myth. people have been dying in ecological balance with nature is due to high and tragic death rates of children and young people, that there's been a balance between human and nature. And that's ugly, and people hated it. They wanted their children to survive. And after the Industrial Revolution, we got soap, industrially produced soap, we got piped water, and we got some medical actions, you know. And instead of 4 dying, 4 survived and 2 died. And that caused the growth of the population. You see, 2 parents, 4 children, doubling in 1 generation. 25 years, 1 billion to 2 billion. 25 years more, 2 billion to 4 billion. And there we went to 7 billion people. And this is what many say, oh, population explosion, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but it was inevitable. If we didn't want kids to continue to die, and people would not apply family planning until they saw their kids survive. Always the death rate has to fall before the birth rate is falling. And then many call this exponential growth. Have you heard the term exponential growth? This is exponential, faster and faster. Since 1960, we have had no exponential growth whatsoever. We've had an absolutely linear growth. And for those of you doing math, you know that linear growth means that the interest rate is falling every year. We added 1 billion in 14 years, 1 billion in 14 years, 1 billion in 14 years. That means the adding of billions did not become faster and faster. But there's so much crap written and said about population growth. So they just put in these X's, explosion, exponential. And you argue for things based on scare, trying to scare people, instead of making them understand. Here, now, we have a situation where we will add another 4 billion in spite of already having reached the new balance. This is strange. Why will we add 4 billions when the number of children have stopped increasing? It's strange. This one, the balance was controlled by death. It was ugly and unacceptable. People would never accept that. They tried their best. This balance is controlled by love, by being able to disentangle sexuality and reproduction. And some religious leaders haven't got it yet. We try to make it very simple to understand. This is a good thing. It's a good thing that you can separate those two. And why will it be 11 billions? Well, I have some more improved educational material from Gapminder here. I brought these blocks here. Imagine that this is 1 billion people. You can see here, 1 billion people. And these ones are children below 15. Here's the age. See, they are below 15. These are the children. There are 2 billion in the world. Next age group, 15 to 30, they are also almost 2 billion. I'm going to simplify. Not falsify, but simplify, really. It's actually 1.8 or something here, but I say 2 billion. Next group, I say it's 1 billion. It's actually 1.4 something. But there are less here. Next group, 45 to 60, 1 billion. Almost precisely 1 billion. Then it's my group, 60 years and older. And we are not really 1 billion, but almost. And we take the help by some really old people who join our group here. So this is the world population today. This is the composition of the world population. You could call it a population pyramid. More in the base than up here. Now, many think that the reason these are missing is because they died. No, no. Some are missing because they died. Most are missing because they were never born. Because back then, 30 to 60 years ago, there were fewer people born because there were fewer women. Then more and more survived, and then we got this situation. Now, the number of children will not increase. These 2 billions will remain 2 billions for the rest of this century. And the 71 year of life expectancy won't increase that much. So let's assume that that stays the same. So if number of children stays the same, length of life stays the same, what will happen? Because there are some people telling me the environmental problems are so severe, so we have to stop world population below 10 billion. Aha, I say, is that so? Have you studied demography? I said, yes, we have to stop it. No, you can't, I said. And I will show you why you can't stop it below 10. Because imagine, let's look at my group. What happened to people like me? Do you know that? No one has a family that are undertakers? They die. We die. The old people die. Some think we become angels. Some things we just disappear. Anyhow, they disappear. What happens to the rest of you? You grow older. You grow older and older and older, and 15 years from now you have changed age group, and then other children come and replace you down there. Can you see? Same amount of children as I showed you. Then the old die. The rest grow older and older and older and get the same amount of children. 30 years from now. Then the old die. It's not so difficult. You get it now. Huh? They die. The rest grow older and older and older. And here they are. I mean, this is, you started down there. Most of you students. 1, 2, 3. This is when you are up here. You are 60 years old. You become like me. You see, when you are like me, it's filled up to here. And we have 3 billion more. You saw the magic? Without increasing the number of children, without increasing the length of life, we got 3 billion more. I'll do it once more. Because you're in doubt. There's someone think here I made this up, in some way. The old die, the rest grow older, and they get children. The old die, the rest grow older, they get children. The old die, the rest grow older, they get children. And there you are. Inevitably, you will have 3 billion more people. Because death starts up here at this age. Relatively few die here. Of 135 million children born, 6 million die every year. It's down to 5%. That's mainly down here, there are deaths. Then death rate is relatively low all the way up here because life expectancy is 71. Now, instead of getting shorter life, what we think is that we will get longer life, and we think we will get 1 billion more up there. Of course, I'm very happy of that. That will give me 15 years more to follow statistics, So, now, some people just wrote in the Swedish newspaper and criticized me and said, we must be less than 10 billion. But who should we take away? Which one do they want to remove? Yeah, should we let, they can take away the old? But there's still 10 billion. It's still 10 billion. You want to take more? Can you kill these two? No, say no, for God's sake. It's forbidden. Don't be in doubt. It's absolutely forbidden. Thou shalt not kill. Haven't you read the Bible? Huh? So what shall you do? What shall you do? Huh? I think you will have to do it like this. You have to force people to just have one child. Do you see? If you do like Mao Zedong, they'd say, you introduce one child family. It's very delicate, and you have to be careful. If they did it like this, then they can get 8 billion. You think people voluntarily will go for one child? No, I suggested to the leader of the Swedish Environmental Party, who argued at one time and said that we should have less people in the world. I said, and we talked with her, and I said, yeah, why don't you start with Sweden then? Because we are one of the rich countries that increased the number of children per woman. It's quite easy. You just take away the child allowances, the subsidies for the daycare center, and you put in school fees. 3 simple measures. As a politician, the number of children per woman in Sweden will drop from 2 to 1.5. Of course, you will lose the next election, and you have to make a coup d'etat, and become dictator. It's very strange how serious people can suggest this. Now, I share the concern about the environment. I share the concern about elephants and rhinos. I share more than anyone else the concern about the climate. But I ain't going to kill people to achieve it. I ain't going to force people to get sterilized. I ain't going to become Mao Zedong, because it won't work. People won't accept it. They won't accept it. And here you can see, so I think we will have to, oh yes, this is like, oh, you can't mix up with population like that. It's very dangerous. You have to be careful with people. You have to be very careful with people so they can live decent their life. I think the solution for the world lies in respecting people, you know, and seeing what it is. And that's not difficult. We know. Everyone should have access to contraceptives, everywhere, but not be forced. Because if you force people, it will backfire. And we know that the poorest in Africa, they will not use contraceptive as long as they see their children dying, as long as they don't have a school in the village, as long as they need their children for work. Malala said they don't go to school because they have to work to support their family. And as long as things are like this, they want their kids. And then some want their kid a little too long, many kids, because some men are proud because I made so many children. And when men think that their pride is having 7, 8, 9 children instead of how well their children are doing, that's old-fashioned, patriarchal thinking. Men have to think, my pride is how well my children are doing, how happy they are in life. That's my pride. And when you get that attitude change, you have to get, it's not only providing services. This is the number of births in the world. It has already happened. The number of births is not increasing any longer in the world. The adults are increasing. You get it now? You understand why these adults are adding. It's these three, just by the fill up, and it's this group here. But it's more to it. It's more to it. We have to go a little more into details. A little more into details. Look here. Now it's late in the evening, and I put a demanding explanation of demography here to you. Each doll here is 100 million now. These one were 1,000 millions, 1 billion, 1,000 millions. Now, 10 out of these dolls is one here. Down here I have, what is it, should be about 20 down there. These ones are Europeans' children, these are American children, these are African children, as many children in Africa as in the whole of the Americas and Europe together, and these are Asian children. And you can see that at the age between 15 and 30, then there are less Africans. Here's even less African, here's very few Africans. So the African population is quite dramatic. It's still increasing the number of children. In Asia, they've stopped increasing. Remember the Asian curve? It was already down to 2. So Asia is not increasing. Africa is at 4.5. They will continue to increase for another 30 years, more or less 30 years. So what happens here is the following. You know it now. The old dies, the rest grow older, and they have their children. Whoop! One more in Africa. One less in Asia. That's why the number of children doesn't increase. The increase of children in Africa is compensated by a decrease of children in Asia and Europe. But Europe is so little, it doesn't matter much. They die, they grow older, and they get children. And one more in Africa. Out of, think like this, out of 4 children in China that pass their 15th birthday, 3 are replaced by a Chinese baby born, and 1 is replaced by a Nigerian baby born. That means that children, conceptually, are moving from Asia to Africa. Children in the world remain the same, but they are moving towards poverty. Because in poverty, the number of children increase. Where countries are more wealthy, the number decrease. That's why it's a good reason to support UNICEF. Children in the world need support. And here they die, they get older, and they get children, and they die, and they get older, and they get children. And this is the fill-up of adults. You remember the 3 billion I showed you here? These 3 billions is the same as that group there, when I make it in more detail. It's a fill-up of people, and that's why Africa will increase so much and Asia will increase so much. Africa also increased here because of an increase of children, and Asia decreased down there. So, longer life. This one. I hope to be this one. I can follow statistics for 15 more years, you know, and see what happens. This we don't know. We don't know here. You see, if people want to decrease the number of people in the world, they think prevent contraceptives in Africa. Yes, go for it. But don't think you can force poor women. Poor women are clever, otherwise they are dead. Don't think they are dumb. If they want many children, it's because they see their children dying, they need their kids to help them. If they get a better life, immediately they will ask first for family planning, to space children, to wait for the next child, and then decide how many they will have. This is a new tool that kept